Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Al-Shabaka's latest Policy Lab. My name is Tara, and I'm Al-Shabaka's US Policy Fellow and the host of our Policy Lab series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the special US-Israel relationship. Over the past couple months, many of you have probably heard more and more talk about transforming that relationship, but unfortunately, probably not in the terms that we would want to hear. For example, redefining it into a relationship based on accountability or justice. Instead, what you've probably heard is right-wing Israeli and US leaders, from Netanyahu himself to the late Lindsey Graham, who have presented a vision for a future of weaning Israel off of dependency on US military aid and integrating Israel actually more deeply within the US military and the US military industrial complex. So the objective of this is obvious. It's to insulate the Israeli regime from pressure to end its ongoing genocide and occupation. Because over the last couple of years, Israel has watched its popularity in the US and abroad really crater, and it's become increasingly clear to them that the dependency-based relationship that they've depended on for so long might not be very sustainable in the long run. But I think it's also important to observe these developments against the backdrop of wider efforts to turn Israel into what they call, quote unquote, super Sparta, all of which are part of that same push to ensure that Israel can get away with genocide and basically endless wars of expansion without worrying that the international community might someday intervene. So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about what all this could potentially look like. What would that military integration look like in practice? Can Israel produce enough of its own weapons and tech to sustain its occupation and forever wars alone? And then most importantly, how would these strategic shifts impact the movement for Palestinian liberation? So to answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Lara Friedman and Anthony Lowenstein. Lara is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Anthony is a writer and filmmaker based in Sydney, also author of The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. So, Anthony, to jump into this, I'd be interested in hearing a bit about. I think it's important that we understand a little bit more about Israel's military history, kind of through the ages, and how it came to be so dependent and closely tied to the U.S. and the U.S. military, because it wasn't always, it didn't that relationship always wasn't always like that. Israel was not always dependent on the U.S. Can you walk us through that history as briefly as you can?
I can. Thank you, Tariq, for having me. Lara, great to be back on the conversation with you. I will give a very brief potted history. When Israel was founded in 1948, the US was the first country that recognized it, but they were not giving really military support. It was more, I'd say, ideological backing. It was President Truman at the time. And it really wasn't until the 1960s that the US and Israel military relationship deepened and expanded. It was partly, I think, hubris after 1967, where the many in America were enamored and really in awe of what Israel had done in 1967, the Six-Day War, taking control of West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And I think that really was in contrast to the struggles the Americans were having in Vietnam, to put it mildly. Of course, there was a quagmire. It often wasn't explicitly said that way, but sometimes it was. And that then deepened over time, over the decades. So I think it's fair to say that by the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and as we move on to Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, there was a general belief that both countries benefited from, this is how they argued it, benefited from the military relationship. They were swapping intelligence. There was an ideological element to it, to be sure. There was a deep anti-Arab racism at its core, obviously anti-Palestinian racism at its core. And there was the Israel lobby was something that existed, of course, for decades, but I would argue really became something we would relatively be familiar with today pretty much from the 70s onwards. There was an Israel lobby before 1967. There was a lobby pretty much from day one in late 40s, but it really has become similar to what we see now, not as powerful as AIPAC, although we might question the power of AIPAC these days with some of these recent democratic wins, but AIPAC is still a very powerful lobby, there's no question about that. So the lobby played an increasingly powerful role, putting pressure on both Democrats and Republicans to give military aid and support, provide weapons. And I think to see and to frame Israel as it's still framed today as the key US ally in the Middle East, a necessary ally against these awful Arab states. And it's worth saying, of course, that when that was happening, there was the Cold War, and of course, many Arab states were more aligned with the Soviet Union. Fast forward to now, which I guess we'll get to, and pretty much every Arab state, really, there are a few exceptions like Yemen, but pretty much all the Arab states are aligned with the US and Israel. I mean, that's the reality. It's not like there's this huge swathe of nations that are fundamentally anti Western. It just doesn't exist. The people is a different story. I'm talking about the leadership. So, in short, yes, the US has had a long relationship with Israel militarily, and I think in many ways the history of that shows that A, it's not a guarantee and then it's necessary for it to continue, obviously, but also I think a lot of it is underpinned by deep insecurity. They often don't say that, but the insecurity that I see, I'm doing some research about this for a new book at the moment, the deep insecurity that one sees in many parts of the pro-Israel community, if you want to call it that, US and in Israel, is based on the fact that public opinion might change. They were saying that 50 years ago. Now, obviously, it's taken 50 damn years to get to the point we are now after enduring a genocide, but that insecurity is there and it's real, and I think it can be exploited. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Anthony. That's super helpful. Now I kind of want to turn it back to the US angle. And Lara, maybe we can turn to you for this. I think over the past couple of years, almost approaching 3 years of genocide, we've watched public opinion in the US, substantially shift. I mean, Israel's popularity has cratered. You have over 60% of Americans in consistent polling supporting an end to US military funding or an arms embargo outright. But to be honest, this calls for Israel to wean itself off of U.S. military dependence aren't necessarily new. I remember reading a couple of years back, Israeli kind of right-wing figures calling for that because they really saw their attachment or dependency on the U.S. for weapons and military funding to kind of restrain Israel from getting away with some, whether it's genocide in Gaza or ethnic cleansing across the region or wars of expansion. They really saw that as a form of a hindrance. Could you kind of paint that picture of what is changing now and why voices like Netanyahu and his allies in the US, like the late Lindsey Graham, are now calling for a reduction in U.S. military aid to Israel and this kind of transitioning or transformation of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Sure. And I think Anthony left us at a really good place for this conversation. That's a great grounding we got. Thank you. Look, over the years, there's been calls periodically, as you said, from pro-Israel folks in the US, from Israelis, from Israeli political figures. Whenever there's sort of a sense that the US is trying to pressure Israel to do something they don't want Israel to do, they say, oh, we need to change this relationship. We need to take away this point of leverage, point of pressure. I would argue that that is really just rhetorical game playing. The fact is that the US has never actually used its aid to Israel as leverage. Full stop. You can talk about what kind of leverage you think has been used against Israel. I will explain to you why it isn't really leverage. Going back to the one time we used aid sort of as leverage, which was way back with Bush 1 with the loan guarantees. That's not aid. That was a loan guarantee. It's like, putting, some limits on the use of a credit card that we were guaranteeing. And the limits we put were drawn so broadly that they never had any impact on Israel's ability to operate. Entirely symbolic. So I think the noises we heard in the pack were sort of like, it's posturing. It was really like, from a very weak position posturing. Where we are today is very different. What we're seeing now is the maybe the last stage in the evolution of US aid to Israel, which, as Anthony said, really started in earnest, the current structure of it in the 70s. But I think it's worth sort of looking back. The US has been giving aid to Israel since the country was born. And you can go back I looked in the Congressional Research Service, one of the reports, Between from 1946 to 2025, we've given Israel around $175 billion in aid. Most of that is military aid. But there was a time when some of it was economic. And this is, talking about the evolution. Economic aid to Israel, which is a first world country, wasn't super popular even back in the day. So if you go to the first time we had this memorandum of understanding kind of set up with Israel, where we had an agreement for what it would look like for 10 years, the first one was in 1999. And that was a 10-year agreement under the Clinton administration for $26.7 billion in aid over 10 years. And some of that was economic, but the purpose of that MOU was to sort of, it's a glide path to phase out the economic aid because it was unpopular and get to a point where we're only giving the military aid. What's important here, though, is that the next MOU, we compensated for cutting off their military aid by giving them 30 billion in aid. All military. So they can say, listen, we gave up our economic aid. We sacrificed that, which, because all aid to Israel is an entitlement, it's treated as an entitlement. We're giving back this entitlement, but we're actually going to get more. So they got 30 billion. The next MOU, which was under Obama, they got 33 billion on top of that. So that it kept going up. It's this evolution. And I should say that these aid numbers that I'm giving you right now are not the total amount of aid because that's not including the cooperative programs that are used for missile defense. So if you take cooperative programs for missile defense, you're adding on an additional, a few billion dollars in aid over the same period. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. So you see this evolution, right? And the evolution, and you get to the 2019, 2028 evolution, and you see with the Obama administration, they increased the aid per year. They did that explicitly at the time as compensation for the Iran nuclear deal. The Obama administration had promised Congress that we would increase aid to Israel because Israel might be endangered by the Iran nuclear deal. So now we've got an MOU that gives them more money there that also puts into the MOU 500 million a year for this National Defense Authorization Act funding, which is for the missile defense stuff. And then you also have some other bennies. I just feel like it's worth mentioning the other bennies that Israel gets. Israel's aid comes in a lump sum, which is dispersed to Israel immediately upon the bills going into law. So most people get aid. The Congress says, okay, you're going to get $1 billion in aid, Egypt. We don't give them $1 billion, right? We keep that money in our treasury, and that money is then doled out to pay for things as Egypt buys things from us. With Israel, that money is stuck into a bank account. They earn interest on it. They get to keep the interest. So we have to give them 3.3 billion a year in cash, which maybe we have to borrow. I don't know how much money we have available at the moment. They earn interest that they keep on that cash. And then, up until very recently, it's going to end with this current MOU. A portion of that they don't have to spend in the US. They get something called offshore procurement, which means they get to spend a portion of our taxpayer funding in propping up their own defense industry. So the Obama MOU was about sort of phasing out the offshore procurement, but leaving in place those other bennies, plus increasing the aid. And here we are now with a new MOU coming up. And it's coming up because these are 10-year MOUs. So we're on the cycle. It's coming up at a time when the MAGA folks are deeply hostile to foreign aid. They say, why aren't you spending this money at home? They're deeply hostile to foreign interventions and wars. Trump seems to not care about that. And so maybe he thinks he can sell it anyway to them. But foreign aid is not a winner here. At the same time, we're now in year 3 of ongoing live stream genocide. The American people increasingly across the board, it's bipartisan and crosses generations, are not feeling great about supporting Israel, supporting genocide. And you get this moment when the Israeli prime minister and others, I think this was something many of us predicted would happen with the new MOU, have said, it's time for the next evolution. And now we're going to evolve away. So no one can say we're getting handouts, even though we've been telling you for years they're not handouts. This is for your benefit that you're giving us money, not ours, but fine. We'll evolve away from that and we'll shift to an entire new paradigm where it's not aid, it's partnership. And by partnership, we mean a new and re-energized relationship between the U.S. and Israeli militaries, wherein they are woven together in terms of objectives, in terms of production, in terms of interoperability, in terms of sharing information, in terms of everything. And that's where we are today. That's what we're seeing in the laws that are being drafted and proposed. And it's what we're hearing directly from the Israeli Prime Minister, who's literally said this, being interviewed, I believe, by Fox News not long ago. He literally said this is what they're doing. That's the goal.
Thanks, Laura. I think it's really helpful that you gave that example of that first MOU being, another example of a time when, they weren't ending economic aid at the time. They were just shifting it into a new, again, like a new paradigm in which Israel remains dependent and deeply intertwined and entrenched with the US, but just in a different format to address the political concerns at the time. And it's very clear that obviously, like, this is another version of that. Could you explain a little bit about what that process is actually like how that is actually being shaped in when it comes to the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, and the National Defense Authorization Act, because both of the the MOU is currently reportedly being negotiated. The NDAA is making its way through Congress. Can you explain a little bit about procedurally what happens along that path and what that will actually look like when it comes to actual implementation?
Sure. Well, look, in theory, the administration has the executive authority, foreign policy, power of the purse, all of managing, obviously, Congress, in theory, power of the purse, but managing the relationship. The way this would normally work is the administration and the Israelis would negotiate the MOU. That MOU would go before Congress, and the US, in terms of what it asks Congress for in the annual appropriations process, would ask it to meet the obligations under the MOU. The MOU is, by the way, not a legal obligation, but effectively it is treated as such. That's the normal way things would go. Where we are today is that Congress has jumped out in front of that whole process with legislation already passed by the House. It's still we're not sure where things are in the Senate. I mean, right now everything's sort of frozen in the Senate. But it's legislation that basically provides, I mean, it lays out the structure of what ostensibly Benjamin Netanyahu and people around him want in the next MOU to look like. I mean, we're sort of seeing this reversed. We're seeing Congress get ahead of the MOU process. So, I mean, it really is. I will say this is we're in uncharted territory here in a sense. We haven't had this happen before. But if you look at the section of the NDAA section, it's now 219. Initially, it was 214 of the House NDAA. I mean, what it lays out is an entirely new structure of the U.S.-Israel relationship, right? It isn't about how much aid Israel gets anymore. It's not giving a number for military financing, FMF, foreign military financing, which is money that the U.S. taxpayer comes out of U.S. taxpayer coffers, goes to Israel. Israel can then spend it according to U.S. rules with lots of oversight. Let's be clear, at least there's transparency on how they're spending it. And it sets up an entirely new structure where Israel, its military interests, its national security interests, its apparatus are effectively woven into the Department of War. And potentially, if it's written in there in terms of where else this can go, and potentially other executive functions. I mean, it mentions Department of Commerce. I mean, the idea here is to find every possible way to weave the Israeli military and its objectives into U.S. structures. That's the explicit goal of it. And it framed as this is in the best interest of both the U.S. and Israel.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I mean it seems like it's wrong to even describe it as a decoupling or weaning Israel off of anything, because it's really just digging Israel in deeper to that dependency and this like creating an interdependent relationship in which the U.S. military and the Israeli military are effectively one.
If I could
Um,
just say something there just very quickly,
yeah,
it's exactly that, and it's more. Two
yeah,
things. Right now, what the U.S. gives to Israel is limited by appropriations. I mean, if the president wants to give Israel more than the 3.3 billion, he has to do some sort of special emergency appropriation, whatever. I mean, you have that. Israel sort of has a ceiling based on what's in this bill. Under this new structure, the ceiling is the budget of the Department of War. like which the president wants to take up to 1 trillion, right? This is that ceiling disappears because this becomes about which projects Israel can be woven into when the overarching objective of this law is to compel the Pentagon to weave Israel into all of its projects, everything it's doing. That's the first thing. The second thing is it actually, I think someone said it inverts the leverage structure. So if in theory, in the present sense, in the present structure, we have leverage over Israel, even if we don't use it. In this new structure, Israel has leverage over us. I mean, we're talking about a future where under this law, and maybe, by the way, maybe you think this is a great idea. I mean, I'm not taking a position either way. Maybe you think this is awesome, but you're effectively setting up a new thing where it's not that Israel is receiving money to buy weapons from us. It's where we're going to have Israeli components in our weapon structures, which won't work unless Israel sells us what we've now made ourselves dependent on. The dependency now goes the other way. It's quite an extraordinary inversion of a sort of basic sovereign function.
Yeah, and it fundamentally changes the way that we can, as a pro-Palestine movement for Palestinian liberation, it fundamentally changes who we, the work that we do and our approach. But I think we'll get into I want to get into that a bit at the end, because I really want to like zoom in on the fact that this is all about impunity, right? This movement to entrench the Israeli military and the U.S. military-industrial complex, that's about effectively cutting Israel off from the pressure that they're seeing from the U.S. public. But I also want to bring this back to, the super Sparta quote that Netanyahu keeps bringing up, right? And he doesn't stop talking about it. He keeps saying that he is and Israel is directing hundreds of billions of dollars into domestic arms production and the domestic arms and technology industry. Anthony, I kind of want to turn back to you and could you tell us a little bit about what this vision actually means? I mean, obviously, with Israel will not be decoupling from the U.S. They'll be entrenched within the U.S. military. But I think we should expect Israel to make a lot of progress in becoming self-sufficient. But how realistic is that actually? And can the Israeli military become self-sufficient in other ways outside of that U.S.-Israel entrenchment context?
Complicated is the short answer. So Netanyahu did talk about Super Sparta, but it is worth saying that when he said it, he was hugely attacked by many in his government. He was attacked by the Israeli public. He was attacked also by many so-called Israeli liberals. We can argue whether they're liberal at all, but so-called Israeli liberals who said, what are you talking about? This idea somehow that we can operate independently is just delusional. What are you talking about? Like, we rely so much on many other nations, not least the US. But actually, there's a bit of context for Netanyahu's comment. He was far from the first one who talked about it. A few years ago, after October 7, Naftali Bennett, former Prime Minister of Israel, running to be Prime Minister again this year at the election in late October, he talked about his vision was Silicon Valley in Sparta. His vision, if you can call it that, was essentially Israel should be a global high-tech leader, that's in weapons and other high-tech technology, and become utterly essential for the global community. He said October 7 happened, it showed that we were incredibly vulnerable, we also were too reliant on others, because after October 7, within days, Israel was madly looking around for weapons and ammunition. And one of the things that people aren't aware of, that they were going to places like Serbia and begging for ammunition, and Serbia was happy to provide that and shipped it to them very quickly. The reason I mention that is the idea of Israel as Sparta is delusional. It just simply will not work. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't argue that. It doesn't mean that Israel cannot, as they are, trying to build up far more of their own defense base within the country, making more weapons factories, partnering with places like India. There's growing numbers of Israeli weapons factories being built in places like Serbia and India to try to, I think, from the Israeli perspective, diversify, not overly rely on the US or, for that matter, Germany, which obviously is the second biggest provider of weapons to Israel after October 7. So Sparta, in a way, or the whole concept of Sparta, apart from the fact that historically Sparta did not end well, I mean, that seems to be something people forget about, but putting that issue aside, I would seriously question the idea that Israel can be this independent nation operating on its own. I mean, Israel's never been like that. Yes, they have, just last year, they sold $19.2 billion worth of weapons to a range of countries, Europe being the number one. Arab countries were desperate for it. Places in Africa, Asia, India, of course, being one of the biggest purchasers. Israel can economically is doing relatively well compared to many other nations that have been in endless war. Although it's worth saying, people often forget this, Israel has the most unequal society in the OECD. 1 in 5, if not more, people live in poverty. 1 in 4 or 5 kids live under the poverty line. I mean, people, when I see these articles in the FT and the Economist, Israel's economy is thriving. Okay, yeah, maybe for some, but you still have an insane and growing number of people who are poor and getting poorer. So Sparta is a lovely idea for Israelis and Zionists to imagine this glorious independent nation on the world stage, but practically speaking, I think it's delusional. I don't think it's going to happen or work.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say, the Israeli economy is working for some, and for some industries. One of those industries, as you know, is the tech industry, and
Yes.
over the last couple of years, we've seen Israel increasingly use artificial intelligence in
Yeah.
Gaza, and as a targeting
hmm
mechanism.
hmm
I'm kind of curious, do you have any thoughts on, if this, new quote unquote relationship between the US and Israel progresses, right? If these kind of this entrenchment moves forward, what is your expectation in terms of how Israel's very advanced tech sector and very advanced stage implementation of AI in genocide, how will that be then implemented in the US and abroad? Because, I mean, Israel is exporting these weapons all
Yeah.
over the world. What's
Well,
your
it's worth saying, yeah. I mean, it's
yeah.
worth saying, and some people may be aware of this, that the US has used huge amounts of AI in its most recent wars against Iran. They've been using tools from companies like Palantir, Anthropic, and others in so-called targeting in Iran and elsewhere. Sometimes the so-called targeting goes well, in inverted commas. Sometimes it causes massive civilian casualties. The US didn't need Israel to show them how to do it. I mean, the US has been using AI targeting for years. In fact, they started using it in their war against ISIS a number of years ago. Yes, Israel did use it in its war against Gaza in 2021. So Israel's massively accelerated the use of AI, and there's no doubt people like me who are researching this are wondering and investigating which other nations will inevitably use, some putting aside the US, this AI targeting. Inevitably they will. And it's worth saying also for people who maybe don't fully understand this, a lot of the tools that Israel has been using and the US are not Israeli. I mean, of course, some of them are Israeli, they're Israeli companies, but they're often American from Silicon Valley. I mean, Israel could not commit its genocide in Gaza without Microsoft and Amazon and Google and Palantir. These are either huge cloud services providing massive data storage for the IDF or the assistance of targeting. And the US is exactly the same. These are not tools that are being used independently by Israeli defense companies. Yes, they are involved, but it's really the use of Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley's willingness. And almost I think the ideology that's at play here is someone like an Alex Karp, the American leader of Palantir, who really, as people may be aware, wrote a book, and his ideology is basically West is best, as in the West is the best, and we need to essentially impose our order on the world through military means if required. I think that very much explains how many in Silicon Valley see what Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank and Iran and southern Lebanon. Israel's been using AI targeting in southern Lebanon to target what they claim is Hezbollah, or often it's huge amounts of civilian casualties. And as I've often said to people after, in the last nearly 3 years, mass destruction in Gaza was the point. Like, that was the point. The idea that somehow, not that people on this call would think this, but the argument often is, well, we see in Iran that the US can target a military general, the Ayatollah. And that's true. I mean, I completely oppose what the US and Israel has done there. But there is a possibility to be pinpoint targeting. In Gaza, the opposite was the point. I mean, there's Israeli security officials, some of whom I've spoken to, who say, they say it off the record, our goal was revenge after October 7. I mean, October 7 left Israel looking like a bunch of clueless idiots against what they viewed almost as a bunch of, guys in pickup trucks, namely Hamas. They were embarrassed, and therefore mass destruction was the point. So I'll just finish on that point. Essentially, what I'm saying is that, yes, the use of AI targeting, AI warfare is going to expand. And I think in many ways, the US and Israel working together on that is petrifying, because inevitably that will lead to other nations using it, not least nations, because this is always the way it works, nations that we view as friendly, so-called US and Israeli friendly states, and also perceived enemies. This is how that works, right? I mean, this idea somehow the technology just stays with us is delusional. It just doesn't work that way and never will. And also, I would just question whether we even want our so-called friends using it. It's bad enough when we're using it, we being the US and Israel.
Thanks, Ed. I'm glad you brought up, those U.S. companies that are already deeply involved, Microsoft, Google,
Yeah.
because I have a question that I kind of want to start bringing this conversation towards, what this means for advocacy and activism, right? And Lara, I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but what are the constituencies, the interest groups, the companies that will benefit the most from this transformation of the U.S.-Israel relationship if it moves forward in terms of integration? And another question I have is, could a future administration or congressional majority meaningfully unwind that process? Or is kind of this process designed to, create enough contracts and institutional interests that that type of reversal or separation becomes much, much more difficult?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the second part of your question. I think the one of the goals with this new structure, this new framework for U.S.-Israel relations, this partnership, which is the term that Bibi likes. Um, I think the idea is that it's difficult. It's going to be, assuming this takes off, and if you look at the language that's in the NDA in the House, I mean, this is intended to move fast. They have to report the first report to Congress within 180 days of the bill becoming law, and report on what they're doing and what's been done already and how it's going to move forward. I mean, this has, they're putting this on turbo to move very quickly. I think the idea is to have this move fast and to build very, very deep local interests, local and private interests that make this very difficult to unwind. We're talking here jobs, we're talking shareholder profits. I mean, this becomes something very quickly which is, out of it's out of sight in the sense that it's not an annual appropriation, which frankly, I think there's also another sector that benefits potentially from this, which is elected officials who don't want to have to go through the annual exercise of being held accountable for how they vote on aid to Israel, right? This takes that out completely. So I think that's appealing, I think, for some people, particularly people who support Israel and don't want to have to deal with this. But, forever, all politics are local. And already, I mean, there's a document that used to circulate in the Armed Services Committee in the House and Senate years ago when I was working with people on the Hill. It was called the wish list. And you had a document that was prepared by the Israeli embassy and a document that along with it went alongside it that was prepared by AIPAC, looking at the money in the National Defense Authorization Bill for the missile defense and all of that. But there's lots more. There's many, many things embedded in the NDA that benefit local U.S. companies. And one of those documents, the wish list, the version I think that Israel put together, AIPAC put together, not the Israeli embassy, but I could have that reversed. I don't have it in front of me, basically included in the pitch for members of Congress, it listed each line item, what the line item was, and what it did for local industry, jobs, economic benefit. It was out there almost like a prospectus, right? This is the investment prospectus and how it affects your city, your state. And I think that's going to be the name of the game going forward. And to the extent that this is a reframing, again, it's not just about giving, it's not going to mean the US gives less money to Israel. It means Israel and Israeli companies get their money via Pentagon contracts. It's just moving the pieces around. And I would say, based on the evolution that we've seen of US aid to Israel, it is built into this is the pathway to a much, much larger and more lucrative relationship than we have today. for Israel.
And then just one more quick question on that line, like the MOU, for example, like I mean, you said that it's not entirely it's not like, set in stone, it's not unreversible. What would it take politically to reverse an MOU if it's agreed, for example, during Trump's term in a subsequent administration?
No, I mean an MOU doesn't need any. I mean, an MOU can just be set aside. I mean, it's a memorandum. It doesn't have any legal weight at all. It has weight. I mean, if the U.S. starts making memorandums of understanding and then setting them aside, it hurts our credibility. That doesn't seem to bother the Trump administration in terms of making agreements with countries and then not, changing the terms after we've agreed to them. It's very, I mean, it's not a difficult matter for a future administration to say we're not going to abide by this MOU or we're going to demand a renegotiation of an MOU. And by the way, Congress can do whatever it wants. Congress isn't obligated by an MOU. I mean, it sees itself, I think, historically as obligated under MOUs with Israel because they want to support Israel, and Israel has negotiated this. Under the Obama MOU, if people remember, the thing that was most controversial in that MOU is that Obama was very clear that it was a ceiling, as in the money for the missile defense. He added extra for foreign military financing, and then he added explicitly into it the missile defense money, which had never before been mentioned in an MOU. And he did that because for the previous 5 years, especially, there had been an annual bazaar every year, bazaar with an A, where every year you had Israel going to Congress and ratcheting up the amount that would be provided for missile defense on top of the FMF. And the idea was we've put it in the MOU, it's 500 million a year, and that is a ceiling. And you had members of Congress come out right away saying, including people like Lindsey Graham saying, no way, it's a floor. We will give Israel what we want to give Israel. You're not going to tell us how much we can give Israel. It's Congress always has that ability with the purse strings.
It's just about political will, right?
In that sense, it is. But with this new structure, that political will becomes much more complicated and much more parochial interests become implicated for members of Congress when they're voting.
Okay. So that leads me to the last question I have. And this is, I'd like to hear both of you on this because I mean the movement for Palestinian liberation, has for a long time really organized itself around the demand to end US military aid to Israel. A lot of people have really set that as their kind of end objective, but not even to mention a total arms embargo, right? So in light of these shifts, how should the movement react when it comes to the policy demands that they're calling for? How should we go about talking about the fact that conditioning aid may never have been enough to deter Israel from whether it's genocide, occupation, or apartheid? Maybe Anthony, we could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dismiss people who have spent lots of time trying to reduce the aid. I think that's been a very important and noble campaign for years, but clearly now it's not enough. And when I think back, for example, to the way that apartheid South Africa ended, that didn't end because aid was cut from certain Western countries. It was things like embargoes and sanctions and boycotts. I mean, that's how that regime fell. It was not simply pressure in the US or the UK to stop aid to South Africa. That wasn't even such a major issue. It was essentially making a country like South Africa at the time completely toxic. And I would argue that Israel has done that to itself in the last nearly 3 years. So I'd say that path is moving along. I'd also say that we need to be very aware, something I've done a lot of work on, is that these pressure points are not just in the US. Israel is deliberately diversifying where it's getting weapons from and support from. As I mentioned before, there's a growing industry, weapons industry, defense industry between Israel and India. Huge amounts of Israeli weapons factories are being built in India. I have colleagues and advocates there who are putting pressure. I mean, the Modi government, of course, is incredibly pro-Israel, so it's not likely to change much while he remains prime minister. There is obviously pressure on other countries like Germany, like Serbia, like Czech Republic, countries that have been essential for Israel's genocide, without which arguably Israel would not have been able to do what it's doing. So I think the idea of pushing for sanctions and boycotts remains essential. I think the idea of isolating Israel ideologically and highlighting what the hell it is doing is still important. I mean, to me, the only reason or key reason we are in this position we're in, because people cannot unsee what they have seen in the last years. The idea that growing numbers of American politicians are being elected, or at least winning primaries, their whole purpose is not, Mamdani didn't win in New York just because of Israel. No, but Israel was clearly a factor. Someone like him, in my view, would have had no chance in hell 5 years ago of even becoming a viable candidate, whereas now he's able to win. I know there's huge attempts to try to pull him down and destroy him now. We'll see how that plays out. But there are, I think Israel has become an Achilles heel, and I am someone just finally who remains deeply, deeply skeptical of partnering with people like a Tucker Carlson. I just use him as an example. I'm aware that he's not quite clear now forming a political party or political movement or some kind of vibe to, I presume, go after Republicans or at least Republicans he doesn't like. It's hard to see him, in my view, embracing Democrats. I personally believe that although I have no issue with alliances with people I don't agree with, I don't think we should necessarily pursue purity politics. I regard that the pro-Palestine movement, whatever we want to call it, going fully into bed with Tucker Carlson is something we should treat very, very cautiously. That's how I personally see it. I don't think you can fully trust him because I don't think he's a big fan of people who are not white. Frankly, I think a lot of this has to do with deep nativism and racism. He may well be decent on Palestine. When you hear him speak now, as many people will know, he's not that different to what you and I might say about certain things. So he talks about genocide and war crimes, but I think we need to be cautious who we partner with, personally. And so I guess to conclude, I think it is vital for those who want justice for Palestine to continue to convince people and elect people who see Israel as it is. I understand that this new memorandum of understanding presents complications, but I'm not entirely convinced that that therefore makes necessarily more difficult in the long run. The image of Israel is in the toilet. They can change the leader late this year, Naftali Bennett or Eisenkot potentially. I don't think that's going to change. I actually don't think much will change. And I think therefore, and I spoke recently to someone who's advising Bennett on Hasbara, good luck with that, mate, and essentially says, yeah, no, we really think that we can change how the world thinks about Israel if Bennett wins, in his view. To which I say, yeah, good luck with that. Because nothing he's proposing was changing a damn thing. Right? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you in terms of it being kind of a lost cause that Israel can regain its already mythical claim to being
Indeed.
this liberal like savior. But I mean, I think that just kind of ties into what you were saying earlier in terms of it diversifying its relationships with
Yes.
other like autocratic regimes that really don't depend on that liberal kind of bullshit line, right?
Yes.
And because that
Yes.
if it no longer buys support in the US, they're just going to turn to Modi in India
Others.
or
Yes.
other leaders who aren't accountable to public opinion. Laura,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as well before we close out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first thought is, and I want to, I don't, I'm not sure if I understood the question entirely, whether you're saying it was good or bad. I want to be clear, the situation we're in today in terms of the aid isn't like someone wants to frame this as like, oh, this is actually a defeat for activism because it's going to be worse. I think that's crap. I think the fact is that today Israel has entered a period where, for a range of reasons, it is really in or approaching full-on pariah state status. The fact that supporters of Israel are convinced that the only way to preserve Israel's entitlements in aid, in influence, or even expand those entitlements in aid and influence in the US is to essentially hide them from view is that is a win for the cause of trying to have people see things as they really are. That's not a defeat. I get very irritated with the people who are like, "Oh, I'm smarter than the activists." Actually, you tried so hard, and it's even going to be worse for you. Like, I'm sorry, you're having to completely shift your approach because actually it has worked. I mean, it's worked mainly because, as Anthony said, people can't unsee what they've seen. But the bottom line is, Israel cannot continue to have the structure it has. This has been overtaken by a shift in views on Israel. That's done. That is not a bad thing. In terms of moving forward, I think the answer is that the movement's going to have to be, in the same way that for those who are trying to defend Israel are having to be nimble and come up with new strategies and new targets, people who are trying to defend Palestinian lives and rights are going to have to do the same. That's how activism works. And the fact, if this passes into law, it's not the end of the world. If you think it's great that this passes into law, good for you. It's not something that cannot be unwound. It's just maybe difficult. If you think it's terrible, keep in mind, this is not written in stone. This can be unwound. I mean, we're in a moment now when the world has a grassroots in the US. We're just focusing on the US for a minute that is incredibly aware, enraged, and very activist. If 10 years ago this had happened and it turns out that X factory and X state has decided to go into joint production of X munition with Israel, probably it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. If it happens today, I'm guessing there's going to be protests. I mean, it's a different constellation of political and policy and activist constellations today than it's ever been. So I would not in any way, become depressed about this. If you think it's bad, if you think it's good, that's on you. But as far as movement, I think movement understands one of the things that movement has that the sort of political wonk class doesn't. The movement knows what it's trying to get to. It's not trying to fight to sustain a status quo. It's trying to achieve something, and it knows what it's trying to achieve. And for Palestine movement, right now the wind is at your back. Right? That's what we've seen now for the past 3 years, and even before October 7th to some extent, with a new generation that's seeing things in a new way information travels. Things are changing. And if this passes into law, for all the reasons that I have concerns about US national security and sovereignty, all of that aside, this isn't set in stone. And there will be a different flavor of protest related to it, a different flavor of activism that comes out of it. And people will, if people care and stand up, you know, they will try to hold their lawmakers to account. And not just lawmakers. In this case, it's also going to be the local economy.
I hint a little bit of optimism there, and I'm a big fan of kind of ending these on a slightly optimistic note, just so that I can get out of bed in the morning. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Lara, and thanks everyone for joining. Stay tuned for next month's Policy Lab that will be announced shortly.
Thanks, Tarek.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.